Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me once again for another podcast. Today I have an interesting gentleman. His name is Andrew Breetzke. He's the CEO of the South African Cricketers Association. Andrew serves also on the FICA board, which is the Federation of International Cricketers Association. Won a number of different hats before coming back into sport. He's a learned individual in terms of contract law, sports law, and the rest. Thanks so much for coming on and having this discussion with me. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for that very kind intro. I appreciate it. Thanks.
No, great. Andrew, you guys, well, as FICA brought out a very interesting report on the employment of cricketers globally. There was a survey done with plus minus 400 cricketers globally from over 11 countries, and most of them are international and test international players, not necessarily test playing, but international cricketers. And there were some very interesting findings, which essentially point to cricket moving towards a sort of hybrid model where the international sort of central contract route isn't necessarily the path that cricketers are choosing, to gain success or to generate revenue, because, I mean, this is a job for cricketers. Just as, we spoke before, before we went on about how this has been coming for the last 6 or so years. So just take us back to about 6 or so years, and let's take a look at what the landscape was maybe, let's say, 5, 6 years ago.
Sure, Billy, and just before I even go into that, I think what is interesting from a South African perspective, we had the highest percentage of our cricketers relative to other countries participating in that survey with FICA. So there's a good South African element to that as well in those responses, which is important when you read it. But yeah, your question's interesting. If you go back 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, we had the IPL. The IPL is sort of the holy grail of T20 events. The IPL in our MOU with Cricket South Africa was carved out. So it's a period which players are guaranteed to be able to exit their contract, have an NOC for that period to play the IPL. And that was how we lived for a while. But it became quite apparent with the advent of Big Bash and other leagues in Pakistan, Bangladesh, where players were being offered good money, that there was this collision course between bilateral international cricket and world domestic T20 events. And like we discussed earlier, FICA and SACA 6, 7 years ago were saying to the ICC, if you don't stand up and manage this conflict between these two, there's going to be a train smash at some point, because you need to manage international bilateral cricket. You've got to protect it. And at the same time, these domestic T20 leagues can't be avoided. And from a players' association point of view, we are happy that our players can earn good money. But to save the system, you've got to manage it. That never happened. And so we reach a point now, which the survey really highlights, where we're saying, well, how do we contract going forward? Because now we have, in an annual calendar, we have the IPL, which is getting bigger and bigger. We have an ICC event every year now for the next 8 years. So as I always say, the ICC has become nothing more than an event organizer just with international cricket. But Nobile, if you take those two events and you take the IPL being almost 10 weeks and can even get longer, you take an ICC event maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks if it's a 50 over, you're already taking a big part of the year away. And you still have to fit your bilateral cricket into that, in particular summer in South Africa. So the time to play cricket has got less. And in our Future Tours program, we actually don't have 3 test series. We have 2 test series, because for 3 tests, you need to have effectively a month. We don't have a month anymore. So that pressure has been building. And where it's now got to, which the report highlights really well through the survey, is, well, what is the new format, new manner of contracting players moving forward? Because there's going to have to be a hybrid contract where a player is contracted effectively to a country domestically and to a T20 league team, which, if you see, the IPL teams have a presence around the world. So you could say we've gone from a system where you contracted domestically in your international domestic contract, you're released to play events around the world. That's moved now, and we're probably in the middle. And ultimately, we could end up with a football model where you are contracted by your club and you are released to play international cricket in certain windows, which is similar to rugby. So we're slowly but surely moving along this route. The big difference, though, between us and football is we've got 3 formats. That complicates things. And the one format takes time and is expensive. So it's not as easy as football because of that. And it's not as easy as rugby. So that's another challenge around what are the formats going forward relative to how you contract people.
Absolutely, and just so to contextualize what you're saying, essentially, is with the advent of the IPL in 2008, that showed global cricket that there is a quick and highly profitable resource, which is T20 cricket. I mean, that had it had existed prior to that, but the Indians really squeezed maximum juice out of that, and now the IPL is the second most valuable league in the world in terms of media rights revenue. Essentially, what the ICC has done is essentially taken that format and said, well, we also want to secure our own revenue, so we will include an ICC event in every annual calendar, whether it's 50 over or T20 cricket. There's going to be some sort of ICC event. And every other country, knowing what the Indians have done with the IPL, has also included their own T20 event in the calendar. So you essentially have a 12-month calendar, which is chock-a-block full of T20 events, and very little time for ODI cricket, which is 50 overs, which takes half a day, and far less time for T20 cricket, for Test cricket, which is 5 days, and essentially leads us to a situation where we are now, where South Africa will have the lowest number of bilateral events, I think, in recent memory for the next few years, right?
Yeah, and you've got to add another part to that, which is a significant and complicating factor, is that you only make money out of your bilateral cricket in any great extent when you play India at home. So within that, you need to play India at home. So sadly, if you're playing against Bangladesh or New Zealand or West Indies, etc., you're losing money when you play them at home, because, like I say, cricket's expensive to run, especially Test match cricket. England and Australia, yes, you can make some money there and break even, but India is where you make money. So it's not as if all your bilateral cricket actually brings in revenue. So you have to box very cleverly here, or you have a problem. So that's a complicating factor we have here. So that's why when India are in such high demand for them to tour, so they tour South Africa next summer season, and that is critical to the future of South African cricket financially. South African cricket generally has always had three streams of revenue. So there's broadcast revenue, there's sponsorship revenue, and there's ICC revenue. ICC revenue will hopefully increase with the new rights cycle. Sponsorship revenue's fallen dramatically, primarily due to what's happened in cricket South Africa in the last 5 years, exacerbated by COVID. And then the broadcast revenue, they've struck a good deal now, but you need that to have India in. And the T20 event we put is hopefully another stream of revenue for Cricket South Africa, who are a 50% shareholder in it. So the way you even manage your game financially, you have to really be smart to actually survive. So there are countries like Ireland, which has got Test status conferred on them, and Afghanistan with great fanfare. They've never had a test. Why? Because it's so damn expensive to have a test. You can't just go and have a test match. It's 5 days. It's longer than that. If you think of the preparation, it's hotels, it's etc. So test cricket is expensive. And all those little factors have brought us to this point now, where T20 revenue is massive. And you mentioned the IPL is worth 6.5 billion in the next 4-year cycle, which puts it behind the NFL as the highest per game broadcast deal, higher than a Man United Liverpool match. People don't comprehend in South Africa the money that is in Indian cricket. And that is exactly what's translated to our SA20. I think ideally the shareholders, the board of SA20 would have liked to have had 2 South African-owned teams in the SA20. But when push came to shove on the proposals and the financial muscle, we know where they're relative to what is in India. And that drives the cricket revenues around the world. So unlike rugby, where there are a number of strong countries and financially strong countries that make up the rugby model, sadly in cricket, it's really India. And then you've got Australia and England sort of as the other 2 in the big 3. And we are not in that league, unfortunately.
Right. And before we get into the report, let's touch on SA20. The 6 franchises essentially are owned by Indian franchisees who have been spreading their franchises across the world. MI Cape Town, owned by owners of the Mumbai Indians in India, and I mean the rest. We could list them, but essentially the 6 franchises are owned by the Indian franchises. Do you as an organization feel like it makes sense given the state of play and where South African cricket is? Do you think that this is the right move for South African cricket in order for cricket in South Africa to be viable long term, knowing that the ICC has essentially played this game and put in this window for the next 8 years? We don't really have a choice if we want to compete at the table.
Yeah. It was inevitable. So it's not a case of do you think it's a good thing or a bad. It was inevitable. It should have happened 5 years ago. So Haroon Lorgat, all the criticism he got, he knew that, which is what he was trying to do. He knew, and we would be in a much better position now had that come off 5 years ago. So we've now been in a position where it was inevitable. It's happened. I think what's interesting about cricket, and I think we're going to be writing books about it, is the pace of change in the landscape. So if you go back to IPL, we're talking IPL teams, historically, for a South African to do well in the IPL, financially get a contract, etc., he had to make it as a Protea player. So you've got an international stature, you've done well, boom, you get an IPL contract. In the last 2-3 years, that has changed. So now we find players who have not yet played domestic cricket in South Africa are getting contracted into IPL teams. So the IPL has changed in the sense that those teams see themselves as international brands and because they're now international brands with international footprints, they've got to have their own development program. So now you find players in IPL development leagues effectively touring, when actually that player historically would have been developed through South Africa. So that in itself creates an interesting dynamic. So I think the next step is you're going to see IPL teams owning 100 teams in England. That's the logical next step, because then they're going to have a footprint around the world. Their brand will be worldwide. Their brand will move into America. And what they will have is a group of players who are contracted across different countries, etc., etc. So I think you could sit here in South Africa and say, no, this mustn't come. But that's just, it was inevitable it's going to come. And the way it's been structured with CSA as the shareholder, that SuperSport are involved. You can criticize SuperSport for a monopoly, but they had to get that deal in place given the history of how these deals have worked. It was inevitable. It was going to happen. And so there's no point criticizing it. And I mean, we work closely with the SA20 guys, which is great because Indian teams historically don't really understand player associations. So that's a challenge in engaging there. But we've had good engagement with some of the teams on some of the initiatives we want to have with teams to help them around education, etc. So these are all positive signs. And I think if you're talking FICA, the future of how we're going to manage player associations, and we are already doing it as SACA, is we're going to be having services offered to players across different countries, standardized. So we are ready, for example, for the international players coming, saying, well, welcome to South Africa. We are SACA. Some of you know Players Association, some of you don't, but you can use our education platform. And actually, you can use our education platform even when you go back to England or wherever you might go back to, West Indies. So that starts creating the international level, because that's the way the game is going. So I think getting back to your core question, it was inevitable this was happening. I think the challenge was in what form would it happen? And if I look at how it's transpired in terms of the structure, the separate legal entity, I think it's the ideal form. I think what is scaring people is the pace of change in cricket. And sorry, I know I'm carrying on, but there's an interesting side story to this. If you take South African cricket 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when we had the big war around the Memorandum of Incorporation of Cricket South Africa, the change to the board structure, etc., the power in South Africa rested with the Members' Council, the President. That shifted across to the Board of Directors when the new MI came, so there's a majority of independent directors. So there was a shift in power there. That battle, by the way, still rages, but there's a shift in power. Now you have a third entity, the SA20. There's a further shift in power to this entity, because this entity is going to hopefully generate revenue. It's a significant factor. So if you just take in 2 years, 18 months, the changes in the power dynamics of South African cricket relative to those three entities wow, it's incredible. It's very interesting and it's fast. So it means how fast does this curve keep going?
Yeah, and what you just touched on there is so vitally important to look at probably in the next 18 to 24 months in terms of how things will shape up with regards to that. But perhaps we'll revisit that one when there's a few pops in the pot further down the line. But
yeah.
Now that we've spoken about SA20 and its potential impact, let's touch on the report itself that came out, and this will show why these domestic competitions are so vitally important. The one stat that stood out to me was 49% of players surveyed would consider rejecting a central contract if they were paid more to play in domestic league. 69% of players have less than 12 months to run on their current contract. And 46% of players rate their relationship with national governing bodies as poor or very poor, with 16% having felt bullied, intimidated, or threatened by their governing body. So players feel like they're not really getting a fair shake. There's only a certain number of central contracts that are available to players, and if you're outside of that, you're potentially in trouble because a further number of players have very limited time left on their contract. So is this more of a job security thing, because players still need to pay their bills right at the end of the day? And if you can play 3 tournaments a year, what's the need for a central contract?
Yeah, there are a number of elements in answering this, and I think the first I'll start with is if you take South African cricket as a triangle in front of you, and the top of the triangle is the Proteas men. The Proteas men generate 85-90% of all revenue that goes down the system. So our Proteas men team are critical to the future of cricket, and that's women's cricket as well. It's critical to the future of women's cricket because it generates the revenue. So for South African cricket to survive, you have to have a strong Proteas team. Okay, so your Proteas players need to be earning good money relative to other leagues, but the reality is these leagues are paying money that is, you can't compete with at the national level. So you have to ensure that your structure for your players is a good, conducive structure so that you've got happy employees. Now, the reality of South African cricket over the last 5 years is players don't trust the administrators. And that's an unfortunate reality of where we've been. Cricket South Africa's focus in the last 2, 3 years, 4 years, has not been on cricket and the players. It's been on survival, it's been on SJN, it's been on the politics, it's been on the board, it's been on all that mess. Who suffers there? Players suffer there. Because for the sport to thrive, you need the administrators to focus on the game. So those type of stats in South Africa, relative to asking players as do they have a good relationship with their governing body, are probably higher than what you've stated there. And I can say that quite unequivocally. So that's a reality that makes it attractive for a player to say, well, can I actually get a livelihood elsewhere? The other challenge is if you just take the South African cricket team. So they went to England. I can't remember exactly what the date was, but June. They went on the tour to England. Yes, some players come and go depending on the format. They then come back. They're here for 4 days. They then go to India for those T20s, ODIs. They go straight from India to the World Cup. They then come home. They have a couple of weeks, and now they're back in Australia. They're going to be in Australia into the new year. They're going to come back. They're then going to play the SA20, a lot of them, not all of them. That's a lifestyle that people don't understand is really, really difficult. So players get to a certain point that we say, if I don't need to live that lifestyle, but I can still earn 10, 15 million rand a year. Maybe I'm not earning 20 million rand a year, but 10, 15 million rand a year is fine. Just by playing the SA20, the 100, and the IPL, that makes logical sense. So that's the challenge we face in terms of the cricket calendar. And at the same time, you want your players to be playing for your country and be fresh, but you try not to deny them opportunity to play where they're earning 5, 6, 7 million. And those type of statistics that you read there are where there are players saying, you know what, sure, if I get offered 15 million to go and play, I'm at this stage of my career happy to forego a national contract, because not only is it less money, but it also means I don't have to travel around the world for 7, 8 months of the year, which might sound attractive to Joe Soap, but for the player, it gets to the point where it's not there. Just what is interesting, one of the other points is that players still see Test cricket as the pinnacle of playing cricket. Um, and interesting, at our FICA AGM, which we had in Australia now at the World Cup, we had a number of very interesting guest speakers. And one was Dan Christian, as a guy who's played all over. And if you ask him, what is the one ingredient you need to be the best T20 player in the world, he will say to you, you have to have played a load of first-class cricket, because only then do you understand your game, which places you in a position to be a great T20 player. So there's a contradiction there as well, because the money's coming in at such a rate for T20 players, yet deep down they're saying, well, we actually need to play the long format to understand our game. So those stats are not surprising, and they're probably becoming more, if we do the survey, which we will do in a few years' time, they will be higher on those figures. But actually then our conversation will be, oh, I see so-and-so has retired from all formats of international bilateral cricket and is now just playing T20s. We already have those players, so-called free agents. So that's where it's moving. Interesting stats.
And this is highlighted in other stats that are in the report. 42% of players are now part of the hybrid market, which is essentially have a contract on both sides. 40% are now free agents, where they're not necessarily affiliated to either a club or a country. They just essentially get picked up by a franchise or whenever it is that there's an opportunity. So essentially, these guys are now contractors, really. And as you said, it's exactly like what football and rugby are doing, in that, without the long-term sort of 4-year contract. And it is quite possible that the longer-term contracts will come into play, because you're already seeing rumors and discussions around IPL squads potentially giving players a year-long contract or 2-year-long contracts just to play in the different franchise teams in other parts of the world. Yeah. Does that not potentially lead to potential problems down the line in terms of influence of these players, if they're not necessarily affiliated to specific teams? And I know match fixing is a problem, but if players aren't linked to a specific team, or if job security is such a precarious thing, doesn't that lead itself to potential issues around match fixing?
Yeah, I think, I think match fixing is a sort of the old-fashioned term. I don't think much match fixing happens these days. I think it's corruption.
Yes, correct. I think that term is better. Yes.
Yeah, as a general term. I think when you look at the history of corruption in cricket and the gambling in cricket, there is gambling in cricket. We know that. And depending on what newspaper article you read, the gambling market in India can be worth over 200 billion a year. It's not only cricket, it's tennis. Tennis have created the tennis integrity unit because they're suddenly seeing an increase there. So I think you need to accept that when these events happen, gambling, betting on these games takes place. And for people who don't understand, it's not just betting on an outcome, it's betting on how many runs go in this over, how many runs will be scored at halfway mark, etc. You can bet on any specific thing. In what over will the first wicket fall? So I think if you go through the history of T20 events, the number of T20 events that have been blighted by corrupt activities. Bangladesh had a major issue, major investigations. And the challenge around organizing these events now is to make sure that you become bulletproof around corrupt activities, because you're not going to stop betting on your event. So, even if our SA20 domestic event, which happened in Potchefstroom, there was betting on that event. It was broadcast around the world. There was betting on that event. And I see it's public knowledge now that there were 20 bookies who were taking bets in live at the ground in Potchefstroom who were evicted from the ground. So if that is a domestic T20 event in South Africa where betting is taking place, imagine how much betting takes place in IPL. Imagine how much betting will potentially take place at the SA20. And where there's a lot of betting taking place, there's also the illegal side. So what will be a big challenge and it's just something we're doing, and we're working with CSA and the league, is our education program around those activities, which every team will be subjected to when they come in. So a lot of these players see these presentations all the time, but it's very subtle, a lot of the approaches. And we had in that SA20 in Potchefstroom, we had a number of players approach us because our players are really well educated. I'm proud of what we do in that regard, saying I've had this funny request on Facebook from this person in this country. They're asking me about the following. I'm very nervous about it, and it's a report we reported on to anti-corruption officers and that. So it's everywhere. It's part of cricket, unfortunately. And the ICC do a lot of good work. CSA do a lot of good work. We do a lot of good work with CSA on that. We spend a lot of money. It's there. And if you put on a big T20 event in your country, believe me, there's going to be betting on it. And if there's betting on it, legal betting, there's going to be illegal betting on it.
That's problematic. And as you said just now, the proliferation of T20 cricket is so high. I mean, looking at the report, in 2003 there was no T20 cricket. 2007, 14% of players surveyed played T20 cricket. In 2016, that number had already risen to 40%, and now in 2021 there was 71%. So I mean, ODIs is 19% in 2021, and Test cricket is only 9%. Lastly, before we end off, what is the future of Test cricket? Does it disappear? Where does it fit in? Especially if you consider the fact that your point around players playing 4-day cricket or Test cricket being better off or being better skilled. What do we do to first class cricket as the ICC or the world of cricket?
Nobile, that's a great question. And I'll start by saying, when we were in Australia, we had a presentation by the head of Disney Star with the broadcast, the guys who got the big broadcasters of the ICC, and they obviously survey this stuff incredibly because it goes to the core of the business. And he gave a very interesting example. He said, take a 12-year-old kid today. A 12-year-old kid today has grown up on T20 cricket. He says, where someone like myself, who's quite old, grew up on Test cricket. It's inherent who I am. I adore Test cricket. That 12-year-old doesn't understand Test cricket because they've only really grown up on T20 cricket. In 10 years' time, that 12-year-old is 22, moving on to their 30s, consumer. They only know T20 cricket. So they see the trends as going against Test cricket. So I fear for Test cricket purely because the time frame. I think ODI cricket might fall victim first, but there is a real possibility that ultimately fewer and fewer countries are going to play Test cricket. There was a very good article written recently. I can't remember who wrote it last week in Australia about the West Indian team battling in Australia. It said we've created this problem because the West Indian team just is a T20 specialist country almost. And look how we're destroying them in a test match. It's not good for cricket. So it might very well be that we see fewer and fewer teams play Test cricket. I don't think it will stop. It will be fewer and fewer teams play it. And we are already playing less. And Australia, India, and England will probably play the bulk of it. And possibly Sri Lanka, hopefully will hold on. But unless there's a concerted effort to rejuvenate it in the calendar, it's under massive pressure. And so, we're not having a New Year's Test at Newlands this year, which is the lifeblood of Test cricket in South Africa, if you want to look at it like that. We'll have it next year. Hopefully we'll pack out Newlands. We've got to have a conscious attempt to rejuvenate Test cricket in South Africa and around the world, or I think it will slowly just become a very elite group who play that format of the game.
And Andrew, lastly,
it's not a nice thing to say.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of us who grew up grew up in the 90s, watching Test cricket was after school. That's all I did for 5 days in a week. That's all you did. Instead of doing homework. But lastly, Andrew, before we wrap up, and we've only got about a minute left. I see the divergence of these issues, and there's one central body which essentially runs global cricket. The ICC has essentially nailed their colours to the mast, as you said, for the next 8 years. Are there any discussions potentially around, if you look at what football and other sports have done in terms of sort of global super leagues and that sort of thing, with franchises from all across the world either playing each other? Is that a possibility in the next little while?
Only if it suits India. You can't think of the ICC as a custodian of cricket, and they will shoot me down on this one. But you can't really see them. They're a members club that manages cricket relative to their members, and there's one member there who holds the ace, and that is India. So we had the Champions Trophy, which was effectively an attempt at a global game, but India scuppered that in the end because it was undermining the IPL. So I think if India see a value in that, it will be. What will be interesting is what happens when you have Mumbai IPL team, Mumbai and Mumbai Cape Town, maybe a Mumbai 100 team and a Mumbai Caribbean. What does that dynamic do to world cricket relative to your question? I don't actually know the answer to that. So I think it will be driven by countries and not by the ICC ultimately. And the ICC have nailed their color to the mast by saying we must carve out our little window for our ICC event, and you guys must organize the rest as you want to organize the rest. That's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, global cricket is going through a lot, and it'll be very interesting to see how things pan out in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. But Andrew Breetzke, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and having this discussion. I'm very sure we'll probably revisit a couple of these in a couple of months' time because things are changing so quickly. But thank you so much for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
Thanks a lot. Only a pleasure. Anytime. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.